Hello and welcome to a special episode of the CX Files. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 16th of September and also is being broadcast on the same date. And as Peter is about to introduce it, I'm sure you'll understand why we put this one together.
We've got a special episode of the CX Files this week, and it's to pay tribute to somebody who I think we can all agree is or was in this case, and I sincerely regret having to use the past tense here, but somebody whose legacy will remain legendary in outsourcing and customer experience, and that is Gareth Pritchard, who unfortunately, after a momentous battle with cancer, passed away last weekend. Mark and I thought that it would be only fitting to pay tribute to Gareth with a special episode of the CX Files that you're all listening to today. And we couldn't think of three better people to assemble for a chat. Traci Freeman, who joins us from Johannesburg, as does Rod Jones, and Dave Rumble, who joins us from the UK, all of whom have been on the CX Files previously. They're friends of our podcast, but more importantly, that they were friends of Gareth's. And with that in mind, Mark, I'm going to kick the discussion off very quickly at a top line level. And I just want to make a point that you and I both met Gareth the first time at the same time. And that was in 2011 when he organized an epic visit to South Africa for analysts and influencers in the outsourcing space in Cape Town at the beautiful Table Bay Hotel. And Mark, maybe you can kick us off here, just remembering your first impressions of Gareth and your first impressions of not just meeting him, but what he brought to the table and what you saw that first time going back nearly 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember at the time there was a big division even within South Africa, because if you remember, everybody was kind of promoting their country based on the principles that NASSCOM in India had kind of developed, and everyone was kind of copying that playbook. But in South Africa, it was almost as if each individual region was promoting themselves. And I know that, you know, at the time, Gareth was very much focused on Cape Town and the Western Cape, but you know, he could clearly see the way the wind was blowing. I mean, he was a great political operator in that he could see that it was going to be much more powerful to join forces with other regions to promote South Africa more generally. And you can clearly see the result of that. You know, years later, if you talk to anybody in Western Europe now about offshoring, then South Africa is generally the first place that people talk about. And I think it's because of that work that was done more than a decade ago to really kind of create that infrastructure and the kind of workplace culture around, you know, why should you automatically think of South Africa first?
But that raises a really interesting point, because I had the same impression my first few trips to South Africa. And Rod, you know, you and I met the first time, I think going back to 2007. It's the same with Trace. I met you guys basically at the same time. And there was a very divided industry in the country back then. It was one region pitted against the other one. If one region thought that another region was going to be getting an investment deal, they'd try their best to scuttle it to make sure nobody did. But Gareth, from what I was able to see, had a bigger vision than that. He had a vision for one brand South Africa, when it came to outsourcing and BPO. And Rod, as we think a little bit about how Gareth was able to maneuver and to drive that sense of purpose for the country, when you look back on it, going 15, even 20 years back, how did he manage to do that in a country that was so polarized in so many different ways when it came to contact centers and when it came to outsourcing?
Interesting you should raise that, and that fragmentation was always a problem in my eyes. And I remember meeting Gareth for the first time. It would have been, I think, 2007, 2008. At that time, I was working with a good friend of all of ours, Mark Angus, putting together the South African BPO and contact center research exercise. And I met with Gareth. I hadn't met him before, in a little pub down at the waterfront in Cape Town. And it was the first time I'd met him, and I was soliciting his support for the Western Cape region to participate and to help us with connections and getting sponsorships, etc. And it was at that meeting, which went on well into the evening with a good few really good whiskies, I might add. It was at the Cape Grace, come to think of it, that I think the bigger picture emerged, and that led me to always see Gareth as a big picture person. Although I think for many a year, the fragmentation did exist for a long while, and maybe Traci's got a better view on that from the inside, and the way in which Gareth used his personality and his resources, his knowledge of the industry, and I think his personal contacts and connections and the respect that he had to bring about the changes which ultimately led to BPESA.
Trace, that's an interesting area to jump in on. Do you have any thoughts on that and what Gareth was able to do, and in terms of the maneuvering and the fact that he did have a force of personality that was, I think, monumental in almost moving mountains in many different ways. And we know that South Africa has got lots of mountains in it, both figuratively and literally. But as Mark said, when you go and you travel around many parts of the world, when you mention offshoring in CX, South Africa is one of the first names, if not the first name, that comes up. And I almost think that he has so much to do with that in the work that he put in going back into the early 2000s.
Yeah, without a doubt, Peter. Gareth definitely had a love affair with South Africa, and that started when he initially came through to South Africa, having outsourced and brought the Lufthansa deal into the country. And having seen what it is that South Africa can deliver, literally became the voice speaking to his childhood peers that were now in business, going, guys, you're missing a trick here. You've got to bring your business through to South Africa, because look what I've been able to achieve. Definitely a charismatic individual. So he had a way of engaging with not only the local community and really creating a cohesion that was sorely needed at that point in time because of the big picture thinking, but also a way of engaging with the potential investor community that was coming in to try and understand South Africa and the different regions and role players. I first met him when he first came into the country, as I mentioned, with Lufthansa, and then obviously with TP, and then when he joined the board of what was then Calling the Cape, which is actually an initiative that Rod had spearheaded in the early 2000s with a lady by the name of Celeste Siren. And the entity had really done a lot, and they'd worked well with the local city of Cape Town and the municipality and the province. And Gareth had gotten involved in the board and then ultimately became the CEO of the entity, which ultimately became BPESA Western Cape, and then later thereon, which is now Cape BPO. And Gareth definitely did see the big vision. Where I had a lot of engagement with him and thoroughly enjoyed that time and got to really work quite closely with him was when we ran the Rockefeller Digital Jobs Africa project. And Gareth at that point in time had actually been asked to hold the national BPESA CEO role, which he did brilliantly, and really at that point pulled the regions together under a more cohesive sort of vision of what it is that the country needed to be pitching and promoting. And there were a lot of skills initiatives, which we still see in operation now, which I believe that Gareth had a big role in kind of seeding and making sure that they got to the point that South Africa has now. And there's a lot of amazing skills and talent development initiatives that were born out of that point. And we're going back to sort of 2012, 2014, and already then there were sort of digital initiatives that were being formulated. We were playing with gamification at that point in time. And Gareth saw how the different sort of industry verticals needed to be considered and pull that into not just a straight voice BPO CX play, but a much broader sort of BPO vision of what could be done out of the country. So I think everyone's used the term visionary, definitely a strategist, a visionary. And I think how he managed to do it was Gareth did and then apologized after. And I think that was his secret to success.
So, Dave, it's interesting because Trace just referenced skills development, and I think that that's an aspect of Gareth that we don't remember maybe enough of as we think a little bit about the legacy of this man who was a visionary, as Trace just referenced. But when I think a little bit about when I would chat with Gareth, and it was always wonderful, you would see that his eyes just light up when we talked about skills and the development of skills.
Yeah.
And as somebody like yourself, Dave, who has been responsible for bringing so many deals into South Africa and for having been able to speak objectively about South Africa and what it brings to the table to an audience in the UK and further abroad, I would argue, that skills development that he really pioneered that has allowed the country to prosper to this day. And to me, that's going to be a major legacy of this man.
Yeah, and I think you're pulling in on something there that as I got to know Gareth, and got to understand more about South Africa, because my first interactions with him were him trying to, having inherited the Calling the Cape and all the work that Luke and Rod and the guys did before. He stepped into some big shoes there. Just in terms of kind of driving it forward. But I think the important thing, he understood the country. He understood the challenges that it faced. He understood the kind of the educational deficiencies, the skills deficiencies. He understood the source markets. He understood what it was to run a business. And now, he's got all of these unique attributes that all kind of, I guess, contributed to giving him a greater degree of authenticity with investors who are coming in. So, I can make the comparisons with other countries, and, Gareth was uniquely placed because he'd come here, he'd set up, he'd worked in a BPO, he then made the transition to supporting the industry and making the relationship between public and private sector and supporting that. But coming back to the point on skills, I mean, this is a guy who was immensely generous with his time, properly understood, the dynamics of bringing, socially disadvantaged groups into our industry and really building that, kind of pipeline of skills. And look, he was brave. He was at sometimes overtly honest, and sometimes, you got that level of objectivity that South Africa might not be for you because of this issue. He'd be very upfront with whoever would listen to him, whether that was public or private sector investor. But that real passion that he had for stimulating opportunity, I think that's the legacy. And then you look at the individuals that have kind of gone on to blossom in the industry and kind of leave behind that legacy that he has. And that's whether it's the Monyetla programs, whether it's working with Wesgrow, whether it's working with the wider industries like Arumbi and those guys, he's really driven that really very hard. And it's big loss. It's a big loss for South Africa, because he's the guy that kind of really got, from my perspective, got the from probably a very low ranking to number one on the Ryan advisory. So you have to take those things that he did and take them very seriously, because he was a superhero. I think he's been described as by some.
And rightly so. And as I think a little bit about the fact that a few people have mentioned over the course, Gareth was not originally from South Africa. Gareth came to South Africa later on in life and adopted the country as his own. He was originally from Wales. He'd spent a lot of time in Germany, spoke fluent German. His kids grew up in Germany and are effectively German themselves. I always have to say he embodied the best of South Africa. He was somebody who was excessively generous with his time, the openness, the honesty, and the willingness to call a spade, I think did a lot of good for the industry in South Africa. And as you say, Dave, I think led to the fact that it was able to constructively build itself, and almost from a critical mass from within over the course of the past 2 decades. Rod, as we think a little bit about people who have been pioneers in the space like yourself and who had a vision for South Africa, do you think that Gareth, as somebody who came into South Africa later on in life and had that global perspective, was that part of the reason he was able to bring that maneuverability and that sense of this is what we need to be taking to the rest of the world? Was that a critical factor in the success of Gareth's professional domain, but also what he was able to do over the course of a couple of decades and do so effectively?
I think you've got it there. Absolutely. I think he certainly brought an international framework into South Africa and built that framework, which subsequently became Calling the Cape, and then APESA, and then Cape BPO. I think that framework, that architecture, the way it was put together, I think the other regions, and I'm in Gauteng, the Johannesburg region, we envy the structures that Gareth put in place down in the Western Cape. We've always looked at it, and it's no surprise that the Western Cape has pulled more BPO work from all over the world than anywhere else in the country. And it's not just the winelands and the mountains, etc. I think it was because of the relationships with Westgrow, with the province, with the operators in the area, with the skills developers in the area. All of those came together into this ecosystem that is still to this day, I think, the envy of all of us in the rest of the country. So yeah, I think definitely he brought in the experience, the skills, and the vision, and became the catalyst that made a vision that I had had 20 years before. He made it a reality very, very quickly. And so yeah, in my mind, that's what I will remember Gareth for.
You reference the relationships, you reference the ability to get to the highest levels, and that's one thing I'll always remember, Mark. It's that when Gareth was organizing an event, you were going to have people, the highest level decision makers, whether from private sector or from government, elected officials. And one of the things that always struck me at the different events that you and I attended as influencers, as advisors, as analysts, was Gareth could cross the party lines. I mean, there were a lot of competing personalities in the room, a lot of people who might not necessarily have gotten along with one another, or maybe had political differences. But when you would attend an event that Gareth organized, they all showed up. Gareth was able to get everybody in the room. And one of the things I really admired was the fact that we were all able to have a constructive conversation. And I go back to the event that I referenced in 2011 that you and I attended, and also the one in October 2016 that happened at the 12 Apostles Hotel. And that spoke, I think, volumes to his capacity to positively get people to want to convene and talk about the greater good of the industry and the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly this is something that you would hear from Gareth when you were one-on-one down the pub with him having a chat, or in a small group of friends. Then he would clearly say, look, the politics of making this work is extremely difficult. And we know around the world that right now politics is difficult, but South Africa's had a complex and challenging environment for a long, long time. And so, but you're right, he managed to sort of skate over that and actually bring people together for the good of the industry. And I think that that's certainly one of the important things that's going to be remembered.
And you referenced the going down to the pub and so forth. One of the fondest memories I'll always have of Gareth was when, Mark, you and I were in London, and it turned out we found out that he was in London via what was called Twitter back then. And we agreed that we were going to meet at a pub in the Holborn area. And I remember having a few drinks. I think our pal William Carson might have been there as well. And we ended up at an Indian restaurant that evening. Trace, there was definitely a personal and very soft side, very sensitive side to Gareth that if you knew him, you got to see that angle. And that's one of I think the fondest things that I will personally take away from my friendship with him over the course of the past nearly 2 decades.
Yeah, without a doubt, Peter. Gareth had a very, very soft side, and I think that's actually what influenced a lot of the work that he did. He was passionate about the individuals coming into the sector. He took a personal interest in the actual agents coming in. I remember on many site visits, him actually stopping and really having great conversations with the agents and be genuinely interested in who they are, where they came from, where they're going. And it was genuine engagements and interactions. And I think that fed his soul, that filled his cup. But I also know with the teams that he's worked with, absolute loyalty to the man who really focused in on how to support them, grow them as individuals for the success, obviously, of the organization and ultimately the region and the country. But first and foremost, it was about them. He was all about supporting them, helping them to achieve their greatest potential. There were certain things he definitely was, he controlled. And one of those is what you've already mentioned, kind of the guest list. He saw the importance of that. So there's a lot that he would just want to spot check and make sure that it looked like it was going to work, put full trust into his team to deliver that. But other things he definitely kept close, and, that he understood how to gather the right community in order to drive things forward, and would use those opportunities, whether it was comfortable or uncomfortable, to speak truth to power. And that is what helped shift the status quo, because he wasn't scared to stand up and repeatedly, I mean, in some cases for years on end, like a bit of a broken record, repeating the same message, but it's because he was the visionary and he saw where it needed to go. And he had a really sort of articulate, eloquent way of putting that forward, maybe a little bit blunt sometimes, but that's what was needed at the time. And we've seen the results of that. So definitely a little teddy bear if you, had a one-on-one with him, and it depends how many whiskeys were under the belt, but super guy all around.
Dave, I want to finish off the discussion with a round of opinions about Gareth's legacy. If we're looking 2, 5, 10 years down the road, what will people identify as being the legacy of Gareth Pritchard when it comes to outsourcing and customer experience in South Africa?
I would describe Gareth as a generational influencer. So, the decade and more that he's had in, really as Rod and Traci and you have, Mark have eloquently described, kind of shaping that kind of Germanic, kind of relentless structure and putting that in place. Without those foundations, the South African GBS BPO industry wouldn't be where it is today. So, I think his legacy is a generational thing. I think, forever his legacy will be defined in that way. In the same way that, some of the first movers of Lufthansa coming in and becoming part of TP, and these legacies that evolve and leave an industry. And I think more importantly than anything else is the influence that he's had on the wider population. So the individuals that are referencing on LinkedIn and referencing his boss, these are South Africans, these are indigenous South African leaders of the future. But indelibly, Gareth's impression and his humility and his approach to life and his passion for the industry, that's the legacy that I think. So I think he's a generational one-off talent that South Africa was very blessed to have in its country for the period that he was there, and his work in building what is an amazing industry for young South Africans to participate in.
Trace, what about you? What do you see as the legacy of Gareth?
Yeah, I'll definitely echo what Dave's just said. But exactly that. I think the individuals that he's engaged with, either as sort of team members or those that he would have had the opportunity just to connect with as they were entering into the sector for the first time, or, have been around for a while, he would have painted the picture of opportunity for them. And taken a genuine interest in where it is that they're going. There's many a times when I was with him on site visits where individuals would come up to him that he would have met sort of 3, 5, 8 years before, and they come up and, Mr. Pritchard, Gareth, I just want to let you know, I started here, I met you, you may not remember me, but this is where I am now. which is massive, but equally he understood that demand and supply. So there's many investors that are now in South Africa and ultimately came to South Africa because of the engagement that they had with Gareth, that they wouldn't possibly have come to South Africa otherwise. And those investors, those BPOs that have now set up, those are the reason that the very individuals I've just mentioned are employed and have changed their family structures because they now have jobs and income coming in, has shifted communities. So I really like what Dave said. It's generational legacy that Gareth is going to leave. He's going to be sorely missed. He's definitely going to be sorely missed by the South African and the global community. So thank you, Pete.
Rod, any final thoughts on that?
I think if I just pick up on what both David and Traci have said, but I've used the term, I've watched Gareth develop a framework down in the Western Cape as a model that worked for a professional body and association to drive an industry. Well, I'm now seeing Gareth as an architect of a much bigger plan, because those frameworks we've picked up now, we're using the same models, helping countries outside of South Africa as we're growing the whole Africa Federation. A lot of those models which we are now showing and teaching and coaching and mentoring in different countries, if we really trace it back to the origins, we're basing it on what Gareth built in the Western Cape. And so I think this legacy goes way beyond the boundaries of South Africa. And those influences are certainly going to manifest as the African BPO GPS sector develops. And hopefully in years to come, I'll be able to look back and see the growth of the entire African sector and be able to look back and say, that guy I had a few whiskies with in the pub down at the waterfront in Cape Town, Gareth Pritchard, was part of the architecture of what we now would be able to look at down on and say success. So that would be my memory of Gareth's legacy, much bigger than South Africa.
And Marcus, I think you and I have talked about many times, some of the most amazing movements, some of the most amazing initiatives literally will come out of a couple of whiskeys down at the pub. And I think, Rod, that's a fantastic way to finish off. On behalf of everybody who's joined the CX Files today, we want to express our sincere condolences to Gareth's family, to all those around him, to those who looked after him for the past several months since his diagnosis. And I don't think that we can finish off without saying that we can all aspire to be better people, better professionals, better individuals, and use Gareth as a shining light inspirationally in that regard.
I'll drink a toast to that. And Gareth will be remembered well as an officer and a gentleman.
Well, with that, Rod, thank you very much. I think that's a great way to conclude the chat. Thanks very much to everybody for joining for this podcast. It was very short notice putting this together. Mark, thanks for organizing the logistics and the technology, and we look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.